What we've done is we've created a bedroom in the street to illustrate the precarious nature of the housing situation for many people in Brighton and Hove. And what we're arguing is that there is a housing crisis in our city. House prices are incredibly high and unaffordable. Rents are going through the roof. The average rent for a 2-bedroom flat is, I think it's £820 a month. So people just can't afford it, and so the incomes in Brighton and Hove, you're at the sort of 50% of people earn less than £28,000 a year. So nearly all their income is going on rent, or it gets topped up with benefits, and then so the government is paying a load of benefits to subsidise private landlords. And what we're saying is we need to be building new council houses, social housing at rents that people can afford, and they can afford to get a job and have a little bit of money for their family. And so we want to see investment in building 100,000 new council houses a year. It is particularly bad in Brighton. I think in Oxford and London it's worse. There's one or two places where it's worse, but it's where there's a high demand for housing and not very much space. I mean, Brighton is hemmed in by the sea and the downs, so the only way is to build it more intensively, but there is space and housing can be built, and we are lobbying the council to build more housing, which they are doing now. I stood as a candidate in the local council election, and a private tenant contacted me, and she said, well, that's great what you Greens have done with the living wage, and that's fine, but what about a living rent, because we can't afford. And she explained that she needed an extra bedroom and she couldn't move because the rents, the rooms were being carved up for students, and so she was living in overcrowded, poor quality housing, and her medium wages were then being topped up with benefits, which she saw no benefit from. So that made me feel like afterwards we got together with other private tenants, and we said, well, let's have a campaign for a living rent, and that was the starting point. And the more that I've looked into it, it's clear that from the private tenants that have got involved in the campaign is that a lot of private tenants are keeping their heads down, living almost in fear. If they've got a relatively low rent, they keep quiet, they don't report repairs because the landlord might put up the rent, or after 6 months' time they might get a notice to quit. So don't complain, keep your head down, or sort of be risk being thrown out of your home. And so that leads you to realise that the power is too much stacked in favour of the landlord. And what happened in the 1980s was the obligation on councils to produce social housing, council housing, was taken away. The regulation on private landlords in terms of fair rents was removed, and the 6-month tenancies was introduced. So tenants have got no security, rents are not regulated, so we're calling for rent controls. And since then, governments have continued with those policies. So our goal would be to say, let's go back to the 60s and the 70s when councils were building a lot of houses at rents that people could afford and work at. Let's have a situation where private tenants have got more security and therefore lower rents because more houses will have been built.
I've come along today because I'm deeply concerned about the housing crisis in this city. We have a major set of pressures on housing, not least because of the government's own policies, things like the bedroom tax, the changes that they've made to housing benefit, that as well as the fact that councils aren't allowed to keep the receipts from council house sales to reinvest in more house building. All of that means that there isn't enough affordable housing for the sons and daughters of the people who live in this city. And what I want to do is to add my voice to others saying that policy has to change. I think it is a nationwide issue, but I think there are particular pressures here in this city. That's partly because we don't have much space to build more. The sea on one side, the South Downs on the other, so there is a pressure on space. There's also a lot of students, which is a great thing, but it also means there's more pressure on housing coming from students. We've got a lot of people who live in poverty in this city, although some people might not know that from the city centre, but you don't have to go very far from the city centre to know that a lot of people are really struggling. So I think we do have particular problems here. We have a very high private rented sector, and sadly some landlords are very good but some really are not, and so more pressure on things like a register of landlords to mean that certain minimum standards would need to be met before they could put their properties on the market. I think that would help too. But ultimately what we need is to increase supply. The bottom line is we need more affordable housing, and that's why we would say very clearly to the government that they should change the rules. They should basically lift what's known as the borrowing cap to allow councils to borrow more, to invest that in more house building. I think they're realistic aims because I get the sense now that there's a nationwide awareness of the problem. So this isn't just a few people in Brighton drawing attention to it. This is a concern that's going up and down the country. Organisations like Generation Rent have done a great job in really highlighting this, I think. And so I think that those voices added together right across the country might well make things change.
What we're campaigning for is for the council to set up an ethical landlord scheme where landlords would sign up voluntarily at the moment to offer their properties at a living rent that people can actually afford on their wages in Brighton, and they would provide decent standards, and they wouldn't go with letting agencies that impose high fees on the tenants. Currently we're collecting signatures on a petition that's going to be presented to the council in November. We need 1,250 signatures to get a debate in the council chamber, and I think we're well on the way to that. People are queuing up to sign it because everybody knows, either themselves or their friends, their children, their grandchildren are struggling to find somewhere to live in Brighton. It's a really massive problem.
When you're on the minimum wage like I am, it's virtually impossible to pay what they're asking for. So the people like myself eventually are going to have to move out of Brighton, sadly, and move somewhere up the road somewhere, which I personally don't want to do. What's happening now, I think it's great. It's lovely to see so many people get off their backsides and do something about it. And I think that it's a good thing if you live in Brighton and Hove. Most of us always like that. If we don't agree with something, we will get up and do something about it, most of us. And I think it's very positive today, on a nice day, seeing people come out, all walks of race, all sexualities, young and middle age, coming out to do something about it. This sort of campaign brings it to people's attention what's going on in Brighton and Hove, and I think it's absolutely great.